You may have heard people say that gear doesn't matter. Well, wildlife photography is not one of those times. Gear can be extremely important. So today we're going to walk you through the Sony gear that you can use to improve your wildlife photography, from lenses to bodies to some accessories. We're going to go through it all.
Together, we've been wildlife photographers for like 40 years. So we've used everything, but we've never accepted a sponsorship from a camera manufacturer. But this is just our favorite stuff. But this video is sponsored by Adorama. And this is great news for Sony photographers because this week they have a huge sale on Sony stuff. So if you're watching this when it's fresh, run over to this link at Adorama real quick to check out all their sales on Sony gear.
And if you're watching it later and the sale has passed, well, it's okay. You're still making a good choice by shopping at Adorama because they have incredible sales. They throw in some free stuff with your purchases sometime. And they even have a VIP program where you can accrue points and then apply them to later purchases. It's all about saving money, getting great gear, and finding everything that you need at Adorama. So check out our links down below to look at what they have. You're gonna like it.
Let's talk about cameras first, and then we'll move on to lenses, as well as accessories like big tripods like this, camo, extension tubes, teleconverters. We'll cover it all.
The first thing you want to choose when choosing your wildlife setup is your camera. Now, you might already have one picked out. That's fine. Just use it to the best of its ability, but we have some recommendations too. First of all, you'll want to use cameras that have this type of shooting in mind. So something like the ZV-E10 or the ZV-E1 probably wouldn't be adequate for wildlife. They don't have a viewfinder. They're not really made for that. But they do have some APS-C cameras that are perfectly good for wildlife. We have the Alpha 6100, 6400, and 6700, and those are $700, $850, and $1,400. And as you shop them and see the features, you'll see that they get more adequate for wildlife as the price goes up. They're all APS-C cameras, and the benefit to that when shooting wildlife is that it creates about a 1.5 times crop with that cropped sensor. So if you have a 600 millimeter lens, it's going to be more like 900 millimeters. That means more reach for you, and that's always a great thing when shooting wildlife. They have about 24 to 26 megapixels, and that could be perfectly adequate, but if you find yourself cropping a lot, which does happen a lot with wildlife, you might see that the resolution is going to look worse and worse as you crop in, and you may be dissatisfied with that at some point. But you will notice as the price goes up, the autofocus improves, and when you're shooting telephoto, that is especially important. Wildlife really stresses your camera's capabilities, so better autofocus will make your results better by making more opportunity for you to get more shots. The downside to those APS-C options is that none of them have a really excellent viewfinder, and that's important with wildlife because it's not just the aesthetics of the viewfinder, it's also how fast the viewfinder is processing information. So if you're quickly panning through the sky, you may find that your viewfinder lags and that you lose your subject in the frame. If you move into Sony's least expensive full frame option, the Sony a7 IV, it's $2,400, and it's also improving over a lot of the problems that the APS-C cameras had. So first of all, you have higher resolution. It's 33 megapixels. It's 10 frames per second. You have 2 card slots, so there's some redundancy there in case you're worried about losing your pictures. And also the viewfinder is faster, so you're not going to get that lag. The autofocus is better, so you have a better chance of getting your subject in focus. It's just all around going to perform better with wildlife. It just is more expensive, and you're not getting the crop of the APS-C sensor. You can budget for a teleconverter, and then you'll be able to get more reach. So I recommend doing that. I also recommend making sure that you get a large and fast card to go in those 2 card slots. Even if you can just get one, it's going to make a huge difference. So budgeting for a 256 gig CF Express Type A card is going to make sure that the card is fast enough to write all those 10 frames per second without buffering. Otherwise, you could find with a slow card, you're tracking an animal and your card is slowing down the whole process. It's very, very stressful. The other thing is you want a big card because you're going to need it on your best day when you're seeing the amazing action. The animal you've been looking for is finally there, and you fill up your card because you're taking 3 million pictures. Get the big card, get the fast card, add that into your budget. You will not be sorry.
What if you have an even higher budget than $2,400? Sony has some great cameras, like the A7R5 is 60 megapixels. That means you can crop so deeply and still get really sharp images. Compared to those APS-C lenses, that means you have a wider angle of view, but still the same resolution when you have to crop heavily. And the A7R5 is a great choice. But if you do get it, save a little bit of budget, not just for the lens, but to get two CF Express Type A cards of 512 gigabytes is what I'd recommend. Those 60 megapixel RAW files really add up fast at 10 frames per second. Sometimes you're shooting action, something you really want higher than 10 frames per second for, like a bird pulling a fish out of the water. The A9 II is pretty good for that with 20 frames per second, but you pay a big penalty on detail, dropping down to 24 megapixels. Also, I find the autofocus not quite as good for wildlife, like it doesn't have animal eye detection quite as sophisticated as the Sony A7R5. The camera that we use daily for wildlife is the mighty Sony A1, and it's $6,500, so it's so much, but it is so amazing. It is the best wildlife camera you could buy from anybody, with 50 megapixels and 30 frames per second and the most amazing autofocus. But of course, your budget needs to be higher than that because you really need two 1 terabyte CF Express Type A cards. And trust me, on a good day, you can fill up that 1 terabyte card. Whichever one you decide to get, be sure to shop at our sponsor, Adorama. They have Sony Week going on, so they have discounts on a lot of stuff. But even if you get here a little late, they still have the very best deals. They include things like free filters with the lenses and free batteries with the cameras. They have great support, quick shipping, and you get VIP points that you can spend on later purchases. Thanks for sponsoring us, Adorama. Now let's talk about the lenses you should get, because, oh, that's a big thing too.
A great option for wildlife, and it may be a lens you already have, is the Sony 70-200 f2.8. This lens is $2,800. It's incredibly sharp, and so it can handle adding a teleconverter to it. If you add a 2x teleconverter, this is more like a 140-400 f5.6 lens, and that's perfectly good for wildlife. Plus, it's a versatile lens, so if you're not shooting wildlife all the time, you want to do portraits sometimes or some sports, this could be a great option for you. If you're looking to buy a lens specifically for wildlife, Sony has a 70-300 or 70-350 lens, and they're good. They're their least expensive options. They're pretty sharp, but if you find yourself cropping heavily to get closer, you're going to see that they're not super sharp and you may be dissatisfied with the sharpness.
A better option for a wildlife lens, no matter what camera you're using, is the Tamron 150-500. It's incredibly lightweight. And even if you end up buying a big prime later, you'll still probably use it for those times when you don't want to carry a lot. If you want to step up from that, the best wildlife zoom we've ever tested, the winner of our big comparison, it was this lens, the 200-600 from Sony. It's such a fantastic lens. You can see I've got a camo wrap on it. It doesn't come like this, but if you check on Adorama, they sell a variety of lens coat options for cameras, tripods, and lenses. And I do find that camo lets me get maybe a full step closer when I'm working really close to small birds and such. The 200-600 isn't perfect. If you want to shoot really close up, you'll find that it has some pretty serious focus breathing, what you might call focal shrinking. And that means that when you're at 600 millimeters close to a small bird, you're actually more like 350 millimeters. That means it's sort of zooming back, even though you're physically at 600 millimeters. You can solve focal shrinking with an extension tube. These Kenko extension tubes just move the lens a little bit further away from the body, but that eliminates that focal shrinking and lets you get a full 600 millimeters when you're working up close. Look at this close-up example with this lens to see the difference with and without extension tubes. Now you can find cheap extension tubes at Adorama, but I had one of them actually break my camera mount on my Sony A1, and for that reason I recommend going for the higher quality but more expensive Kenko extension tubes. If you're using a low megapixel body, like a Sony A9 or even a Sony A7 III, I would put a 1.4 times teleconverter on this to get a little bit extra reach. But if you have a camera with more than 33 megapixels, we find you don't really benefit. If you have the 50 or 60 megapixel cameras, you'll get all the detail you can possibly get out of this lens, even at 600 millimeters. No teleconverter necessary. The ultimate lens, if you have the budget, is the Sony 600mm f4. This is incredible. It's super heavy. It's really huge, a pain to carry. Oh, and it's $13,000. It's also just 600mm, and that last lens was 600mm. So what's the difference? The difference is, well, it's this. It's the f4 part. It's the massive opening that is letting in 3 times more light than that amazing 200 to 600. That's what you pay for. That's what you carry around. That light makes such a huge difference. First, when you're working up close, little birds in the forest and such, it will create great bokeh, much more background separation, making your pictures really look 3D. And in low light conditions, especially like in a forest, it'll produce way cleaner images by gathering so much more light at f4. If you're using a full frame camera, even the A7R5 at 60 megapixels, you can still attach a 1.4 teleconverter and get incredibly sharp images that will improve your detail. And I often use a 1.4. With those high-res cameras, I do not use a 2x teleconverter. I find it doesn't add any detail really because you're already extracting so much out of this lens. But if you are using a lower megapixel camera like a Sony A9, a Sony A7 IV, then go ahead and consider using a 2x teleconverter for those times when subjects are far away and you need a little extra reach. Notice that I have this big tripod here, and this is kind of a lot to carry and pay for. This is the Gitzo gimbal tripod that we use, and you can see it's so smooth. This means wildlife video is now on the menu, and it also means I don't wear my arms out holding this up, waiting for something to come. You know, I can hand hold this for a couple of minutes, but the thing is, if I'm waiting for something to show up, I have it down, and then it shows up and I lift it up, and sometimes this is enough to startle the animal. So just keeping the camera horizontal and at the ready can really improve your wildlife pictures, and that's the reason that I also carry around this huge tripod. If you do end up getting this lens and using a tripod, I recommend replacing the handle here with this one that has the quick release plate built in. That just makes it a little bit lighter and a little bit easier to carry.
We have covered a lot. Even this little cover, we've got lenses, we've got cameras. Is there anything that we're forgetting? Maybe you've been using something that's working well for you. Let us and everyone else know in the comments down below. And don't forget to check out Adorama for great gear and all of the gear that any creator could imagine, from cameras to lights to backpacks. They have it all with great prices. So check out our link down below. Go to Adorama.
Especially this week, because they have Sony week going on with big sales specifically on Sony gear. That's what we're talking about, Sony gear this week. Thanks for sponsoring us, Adorama. Don't forget to subscribe. We have tutorials and reviews coming up. Bye. It's an easy problem to solve with a couple of teleconverters. Teleconverters, which I have here. I said teleconverters. Can I get this in focus? That's an easy problem to solve with a couple of teleconverters. Teleconverters go between...
Wait, is that an extension tube?
Did I say teleconverter?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. You can solve focal shrinking with an extension tube. I'll show you the difference between with and without a teleconverter.
That's an extension tube.